congratulations. We're going to check out Chuck's 1966 FJ45 LV. Chuck's interest in Land Cruisers first started back way in the 70s when he was at high school, where him and a mate with a Land Cruiser would kick around North California. But Chuck's first FJ40 was a 1972. Bit of rust and a bit of prime, but he only paid $1,500 for it back in 1988. Only owning it for a year and then selling it to someone who wanted it more than he did and making a bit of cash on it. Then a few years later, in 93, Chuck ended up selling his 1969 Corvette convertible, which he had had for 12 years, to go and buy a 1969 FJ40, which he only spent $1,300 on it. Then put another couple $1,000 into it over the next couple of years before it was ready for some family touring, camping and wheeling trips. But only after 5 years they decided they needed to upgrade. So they ended up selling it, ended up buying a Chevy Suburban, a more practical truck, but not as fun. Chuck tells me he went a fair few years without having a fun car. So then, in 2004, Chuck decided it was time to get something a little bit more fun in his life again, and went out and bought himself a 1963 Chevy Nova SS, then moving on to a 1967 GTO. Chuck loved this car, and he was sure that this was the car that he was going to own until the day he died and the boys would have to fight over it. But then, in around 2015, one of Chuck's sons came up to him and said, "Dad, one of the most memorable times of my life was when we used to own the old FJ40 red truck and go out camping and touring as a family. Dad, can you help me find one?" Chuck was pretty excited, and it just so happened he had a friend that had a Capri Blue 1970 FJ40 for sale and made a smoking deal for his son to pick it up on. After a year or so of driving it around, one of the piston rings broke, number 6. Chuck did a complete teardown and rebuild of the motor. And after spending a year or so back and forward to the Land Cruiser graveyard, he started to catch the bug. Then after swapping out the engine earlier in February, Chuck got bit hard by the FJ bug again. So Chuck did something that he never normally does. He rang a mate and told him that he was in the market for a new FJ. After asking him a few different questions, how much he wanted to spend, project versus no project, V8 versus standard, Chuck told him he was not after a project, but he really wanted something in spring green. Chuck's mate said, "I might have something up here for you." In the last weekend in February, Chuck and his son jumped in his son's FJ40 newly built engine and headed down to see Roger, who was pretty impressed with how the motor sounded. Roger said to him, "Let's go see what you can find you." After opening up a barn that had 3 FJ40s pretty much fully restored, ready to go, and around the right price, they looked pretty good, but none of them really grabbed Chuck. The seller had a huge sneaky grin on his face. He said to Chuck, "I think I might have something you would like." Took him over to a shipping container. Without saying much more, they moved a decrepit old ladder, some old tyres, some old drums, and pushed out an old Camaro out of the way, opened up this shipping container to see some type of variant of FJ under a cover. The cover got lifted up to reveal a long badge of a 45 LV Toyota Land Cruiser. And it was spring green! Chuck could see it was obviously an abandoned project. It turns out that he had bought it from a winery in 2001 and drove it fairly regularly until March 2005. He'd started to restore it, boxed and bagged everything that came off it, painted the inside and outside in spring green, but at some point ran into some obstacles which caused him to lose traction, get involved in some other projects, shoving it into a shipping container, covering it and closing the door, never to look at it again until Chuck came calling. Chuck was hooked. He spent about 10 minutes checking it out and asked what spares he had for it. He was told that he had all the glass, switches, wiring, interior, pretty much everything. Chuck thought the price was fair and asked him to give him a couple of weeks to sell his beloved GTO, and they shook on the deal. Chuck loved his GTO, but he wasn't enjoying it anymore, if that makes sense. But he knew he would have a lot more fun with this new project. When they got to Roger's place, the LV was already out of the container and on a lift in the garage. It had been dragged out of the container due to frozen brake drums, and the skid marks were there to prove it. Now home, Chuck had a plan of attack. Immediately putting it on jack stands, took off the wheels and started looking at the locked brakes. Apparently it had all been done as part of the first step in the restoration, before the last owner painted it, then lost interest. To be sure, he pulled up every drum, inspected for leaks, broken parts, etc. Everything was okay. Checked oil pressure, fuel in the carb, reattached everything and reached for the first click of the key. It was a bit sticky, but it fired up. Chuck was just getting ready to shut it down when he noticed the fuel gashing out of the top of the carby.
Now.
Forward now?
Yeah.
It's all frothing around.
That'll do it, yeah. Funny.
Hearing it run motivated Chuck and realised that even considering the amount of work that was looking at, Chuck got a fantastic deal on the Cruiser and knew that virtually every car project in his entire life had prepared him for this one. Chuck is also inspiring his granddaughter into the 40 series, converting this little toy car into a ripper copy of his FJ40. Chuck, I have to admit, it was the spring green that drew me to your project. Chuck, you've come full circle in your 40 series story, starting your car journey with an FJ40 back in the 80s and inspiring 2 generations of family members along the way for your love of cruisers. With a number of beautiful vehicles in between, you've come back to a project that I'm sure will bring you much joy and satisfaction. Not only to you, but also to your family and some of your close mates too. Good on you, mate. Thanks for sharing your story and letting me share in your story with the rest of the world. Really appreciate it. Anyway, guys, take care of yourselves, and until next time, see you around.